Dr. Miriam Osaibansu had been reviewing chest x-rays for 11 consecutive hours when the paramedics wheeled him through the double doors of Hargrove Memorial's cardiac emergency wing. I saw the name on the intake form before I saw his face. Quaim Osai, 64 years old. Suspected STEMI, ST elevation myocardial infarction, a full blockage of the left anterior descending artery, the one cardiologists call the widowmaker without irony. My father. He was gray under the fluorescent lights. His hands, which had once pointed at me across a Christmas dinner table and told me I was chasing fantasies, were curled at his sides like something already surrendering. The paramedics were talking fast. Blood pressure 88/60, pain radiating into the left jaw, onset approximately 40 minutes prior. I was the chief of cardiology at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center. I had approved every interventional cardiologist on the floor. I had written the department's triage protocol that the paramedics were following at that exact moment. I had signed my father's fate into this building years before he arrived in it, and he had no idea. He looked up from the gurney and his eyes found mine, and for a moment, 1 second, maybe two, there was nothing in his face but a patient's animal fear. Then recognition arrived, and the fear became something more complicated. "Miriam," he said. "Dr. Osaibansu," I said, and I kept walking beside the gurney toward the cath lab. I approved the surgery. "Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you've ever been told you would never amount to anything by someone who should have believed in you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. Because what happened in that cardiac catheterization laboratory on New Year's Eve is not the beginning of this story. It is only the moment the beginning finally became visible. To understand why I walked into that operating suite with my hands steady, and my chart notes precise, and my voice completely calm, you have to go back with me. 22 years back. To a kitchen in Accra, Ghana, and then to a kitchen in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and to a Christmas dinner that I have never fully described to anyone until right now. I was 23 years old in December of 2003, and I had just been accepted to the pre-medical post-baccalaureate program at Whitmore College in Cincinnati. The acceptance letter was printed on cream paper. I had read it so many times the fold lines had gone white and soft. I kept it in the inner pocket of my winter coat because our apartment ran cold, and I wore the coat inside most evenings. I had come to the United States 4 years earlier with my parents and my 2 older brothers, Kofi and Emmanuel, and my mother's sister, Auntie Adwoa. We had landed in Columbus with 4 suitcases and the address of a distant cousin who let us sleep in his living room for 6 weeks. My father worked overnight security at a warehouse distribution center. My mother cleaned offices. Kofi and Emmanuel, who were 28 and 26 respectively, had found construction work and were already sending money back to relatives in Accra. I was the youngest. I was the one who had been, back in Ghana, the student who stayed after class to ask the biology teacher additional questions. I was the one who had, at 16, sat at the bedside of my grandmother during her final illness and watched the physician, a calm, certain woman named Dr. Asantua, move through the room with a kind of authority that looked to me like the purest form of competence I had ever witnessed. I had decided then. I had not told anyone. When I showed my father the acceptance letter, he was eating. He looked at it for a moment the way you look at a bill you are not going to pay. He set it beside his plate. "How much?" he said. "The program is $14,000 for the year, but there's financial aid and I've applied for 3 scholarships, and if I get a part-time position in the campus lab, $14,000. He said it the way people say the name of a disease. "Miriam, you are a girl from nowhere. You have a community college degree. You are not a doctor. You will never be a doctor. Who told you to want this?" My mother looked at her plate. Auntie Adwoa, who was sitting beside me, moved her hand toward mine and then pulled it back. Kofi said, without looking up from his food, "Let her apply for the hospital administration certificate. 2 years she can work at the front desk." Emmanuel nodded. "Stable," he said. I folded the letter and put it back in my coat. My father was not finished. "We did not come to this country so you could have fantasies. We came so the family could survive. You want to spend $14,000 we don't have on a dream that doesn't exist for someone like you. The medical schools here, they take the Americans, the ones with money, the ones with connections, not us." "I have a 3.91 GPA, I said. "That is wonderful," he said. "Keep it. Get a good job. Stop embarrassing yourself." That was the last conversation we had about my ambitions for 4 years. not because I agreed with him, because I had learned in that moment that argument was a waste of a resource I could not afford to spend. I had tuition to figure out. I had an acceptance letter. I had, somewhere inside me, the image of Dr. Asantua walking through my grandmother's hospital room with her stethoscope around her neck, like something she had earned every single day. The program cost $14,000. My father did not contribute a single cent. He had, in previous years, helped Emmanuel purchase a used pickup truck for $7,400 and had given Kofi $6,200 toward a security deposit on an apartment. That math did not escape me. It never has. I worked 22 hours a week at a grocery store on East Broad Street. I took out $9,500 in federal loans. I found a scholarship through a nonprofit called the Morrow Foundation that covered $3,200. I found the remaining $1,300 by tutoring 3 undergraduates in introductory biology at $8 an hour, which I charged because that was what the campus tutoring center charged, and I saw no reason to discount myself. I wrote down the name of the cardiovascular medicine track at Whitmore on a piece of notebook paper. I folded it in quarters and put it in my wallet behind my library card. I kept it there for 6 years. The near failure came in the spring of my second year of medical school at Hargrove University College of Medicine, and it came in the form of a rejection letter from the Cardiovascular Research Fellowship I had applied to at the Bellingham Cardiovascular Institute in Pittsburgh. The fellowship paid a $24,000 annual stipend and came with supervised access to a catheterization laboratory. I had worked on my application for 11 weeks. The rejection was 4 sentences. Dr. Yolanda Ferrer-Banks, the program director, had signed it personally. I sat in my apartment in Cincinnati with the letter on the kitchen table for a long time. It was a Tuesday in April. I remember the quality of the light through the window, flat and gray, the kind of light that doesn't help anything. I had $380 in my checking account. I had $62,000 in student loan debt. I had, the previous semester, scored in the 94th percentile on my cardiovascular physiology examination, a fact that felt, in that moment, entirely without weight. I nearly called my father. I don't know what I would have said, probably nothing useful. I sat with the phone in my hand for about 3 minutes and then I put it down. I called Dr. Marcus Ajay Mensah instead. Dr. Ajay Mensah was an associate professor of cardiology at Hargrove University, and the only person in my academic life who had said to me, directly and without qualification, that I had the clinical instincts of someone who belonged in interventional cardiology. He had said this after I had correctly identified a subtle right bundle branch block on an EKG during a second-year lab session when 3 other students, all of whom had better connected application files than I did, had missed it entirely. I got the Bellingham rejection, I told him. I know, he said. Dr. Ferrer-Banks called me. She said the cohort was unusually competitive this year. She said your application was in the final 7. There were 5 spots. There were 5 spots, he agreed. Apply to the Caldwell Cardiology Research Program at St. Ignatius in Cleveland. The deadline is in 3 weeks. I will write you a letter that Dr. Ferrer-Banks will hear about. Do you know her? We trained together, he said. Apply, I applied. The Caldwell program accepted me in May with a $21,500 annual stipend. It was not the Bellingham Fellowship. It was enough. I did not tell my family that I had been accepted to anything. At Easter, which I attended because my mother asked me to, my brother Emmanuel mentioned that his wife, Priscilla, was pregnant with their second child. The entire dinner was about that. I ate my jollof rice and I listened, and I thought about the catheterization procedure I had observed the previous week. The way the contrast dye bloomed through the coronary arteries on the fluoroscopy screen like a dark flower opening. My family asked me nothing about my studies. I offered nothing. The first RPM keyword I ever heard applied to my own life came from a hospital administrator named Deborah Szymanski at St. Ignatius, who pulled me aside after a research presentation in October of my fellowship year to tell me that my health insurance coverage through the fellowship would lapse if I failed to re-enroll by the 15th of the month. She said it so casually, the way people say things they assume everyone already knows. I had not known. I re-enrolled that afternoon. It was the first time I had health insurance coverage I had obtained entirely through my own professional standing, without my parents' workplace plan, and this sounds strange, I felt like I had crossed something. A line I had not known was there until I was standing on the other side of it. The Caldwell program was where I became the cardiologist I intended to be. I spent 2 years at St. Ignatius Medical Center in Cleveland, in a department run by Dr. Renata Kowalski, a woman of 51 who had completed her interventional fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic in 1989, and who had, in 30 years of practice, a near-mythological reputation for diagnostic accuracy. She could read a coronary angiogram the way musicians read a score, quickly, completely, with an immediate sense of what was wrong and what it would cost to fix it. She did not compliment people easily. In my first 3 months, she corrected me 12 times in front of other staff. She corrected me fairly each time, which made it worse and better simultaneously. In March of my second year, we admitted a 58-year-old patient named Gerald Hutchinson Park, who presented with atypical chest discomfort that his primary care physician had twice attributed to acid reflux. His medical records showed 2 previous specialist appointments over 18 months, neither of which had resulted in a cardiac workup. I reviewed his records on a Thursday morning, and something was wrong in a way I could not immediately name. I ordered an echocardiogram and a cardiac stress test over the objection of the senior resident, who thought I was overtesting. The stress test was positive. The angiogram showed a 70% stenosis of the right coronary artery. We stented him on a Friday afternoon. He went home Monday. Dr. Kowalski found me in the hallway on Tuesday. "You read that man correctly when 2 other physicians didn't," she said. "That is not luck. I want you on the interventional track. I am going to make some phone calls." I had been awake for 31 hours. I said, "Thank you, Dr. Kowalski." She nodded once and walked away. I stood in that hallway for a moment longer than was necessary. Through the window at the end of the corridor I could see the Cleveland skyline in the early morning light, gray and solid and indifferent, and I thought about my father's kitchen table and the cream-colored letter and the way he had set it beside his plate. I did not cry. I have never been a person who cries about victories. I pressed my hand flat against the window glass, which was cold, and I felt the cold, and then I went to write my notes. I could have called home that evening. I had my mother's number in my phone, and she would have answered, and she would have said something warm and a little vague, and the call would eventually have reached my father's ears, and he would have said something that would have made me smaller than I was in that hallway. I didn't call. I made a cup of coffee and I reviewed the next morning's cath lab schedule and I thought, not yet. She had no idea what I had become. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. I completed my interventional cardiology fellowship at the Hargrove University Hospital System, the same institution where I had attended medical school, which felt like a circle closing, though not the last one. I was board certified in interventional cardiology in September of 2014. I was 34 years old. By January of 2016, I had been appointed attending interventional cardiologist at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center, the flagship hospital of the system, ranked 4th in the state for cardiac care by the Regional Health Authority's annual review. I had published 7 peer-reviewed papers, 3 of which concerned outcomes in patients with delayed specialist appointments, patients like Gerald Hutchinson Park, patients who had been passed from one office to another while their coronary arteries narrowed quietly inside them. In March of 2018, Dr. Ajay Mensah, who had become the chair of Hargrove University's cardiology department, called me into his office and told me that Dr. Elias Varga, the chief of cardiology at Hargrove Memorial, had announced his intention to retire at year's end. "The search committee is forming," Dr. Ajay Mensah said. "I want to submit your name." "I'm 41, I said. "Elias was 43 when he was appointed," he said. "Your publication record is stronger than his was. Your procedural volume is in the top 5% of attendings in this system. Your patient outcomes are documented." He paused. "Miriam, I wrote you a letter for the Caldwell program when you had $380 in your bank account and a rejection letter on your table. I am not nominating you as a favor. I am nominating you because you are the correct person for this position." I looked at the wall of his office, where he had framed his own board certification and his fellowship certificate and a photograph of himself as a young resident in the late 1980s, impossibly thin in a white coat that was too large for him. "Submit it," I said. The appointment process took 8 months. There were 3 other candidates, all of them men, 2 of them older than me by at least a decade. The search committee interviewed me 3 times. I was asked, in the second interview, whether I believed my relative youth would create friction with senior attendings. I said that friction was a reasonable response to leadership change, and that I had found, in my clinical practice, that the best way to address friction was to be consistently correct about the medicine. The committee chair, a woman named Dr. Patricia Nguyen Holloway, wrote something on her notepad when I said that. I was appointed Chief of Cardiology at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center on November 19, 2018. My salary was $387,000 annually. My department had 42 physicians, 19 of whom were attendings. My name went on the door of the coroner office on the 6th floor of the cardiac wing 3 days before Thanksgiving. The person I told first was not a family member. It was my colleague and friend Dr. Josephine Tambali-Reeves, an emergency cardiologist who had been at Hargrove Memorial for 6 years, and who had once, at 2 in the morning after a particularly brutal overnight shift, sat with me in the hospital cafeteria and listened to me describe every single thing my father had said at that Christmas dinner in 2003. She had not offered advice. She had listened with the kind of attention that is itself a form of generosity. I called her from the parking garage. "They gave it to me," I said. There was a pause, and then she said, "Miriam." "Oh, Miriam," in a voice that held everything I didn't know how to say about myself. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I drove home. I had in my glove compartment, I had transferred it there years ago from my wallet, which had worn it thin, a folded piece of notebook paper. I took it out. Cardiovascular Medicine Track, Whitmore College. The letters had faded. I knew what they said. I did not call Columbus. The professional collision I had spent years not thinking about first announced itself 4 months after my appointment, in the form of a referral slip that came through my administrative coordinator, a woman named Celestine Acaffer, on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2019. The patient name on the referral was Kwame Osa. Age 63. Referred for evaluation of exertional chest pain by a primary care physician in Columbus, named Dr. Harold Levenchow. The referring note mentioned a family history of coronary artery disease. Celestine brought it to me personally because she knew my last name. "Is this related to you?" she asked carefully. I looked at the referral for a long time. His insurance policy was listed. His date of birth. His address, still the same apartment in Columbus where I had eaten Christmas dinner in 2003. "Schedule him with Dr. Tambali-Reeves," I said. "Tell her I'd like a courtesy update when she's completed her assessment." Celestine nodded and left without asking anything further. I stood at my office window and looked out at the hospital's east courtyard, where a maintenance worker was clearing dead leaves from around a bench in the gray March light. My father had chest pain. He was 63 years old. He had a family history of coronary artery disease, because his own father had died of a heart attack at 59, a fact I knew from medical history, and from the photograph of my grandfather that hung in our Columbus apartment above the television, a man I had never met. My father did not know I was chief of cardiology at the hospital his primary care physician had just referred him to. He had not called to tell me he was having chest pain. He had not called to tell me he had seen a cardiologist. He had not called. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. He canceled the appointment. Celestine told me on a Thursday, Dr. Levenchow's office had called to confirm, and the appointment had been canceled from the patient side without rescheduling. No reason given. I asked her to flag his name if another referral came through from any Columbus area physician. That was in March. 9 months passed. I saw 712 patients in those 9 months. I revised the department's emergency triage protocol for acute coronary syndrome presentations. I co-authored a paper on door-to-balloon time outcomes in minority patient populations that was accepted by the Journal of the American College of Cardiology in August. I attended Kofi's daughter's 6th birthday party in Columbus in July, where my father sat at the opposite end of the yard, and we spoke for approximately 4 minutes, during which he asked me if I was still working at the hospital, and I said yes, and he said good, and turned back to his conversation with Emmanuel. My mother pulled me into the kitchen to show me a new pot she had bought, and to give me a container of groundnut soup to take home, and that was the Columbus trip. In October, I attended a cardiology conference in Atlanta, where I presented the outcomes data from a 2-year study of our department's stenting protocols. Afterward, a physician from Emory named Dr. Kenneth Ibarra-Walsh introduced himself and told me he had cited my research on delayed specialist appointment outcomes in a paper he was preparing. We exchanged cards. I noted, on the flight home, that my research was being used to argue for changes in how insurance policy structures affected patient access to cardiac care. That specificity pleased me in the way that good work pleases you when it connects to something you have known for a long time. In November, I met with Hargrove Memorial's legal team regarding a departmental credentialing matter. The attorney assigned to the case was a woman named Sandra Korhonenbell from the firm of Drysdale, Mock and Associates, and she was precise and unhurried in a way I found professionally reassuring. The matter was resolved without escalation. Before she left, she mentioned that her firm also handled estate planning and that a number of the hospital's department heads had engaged them for that purpose. I filed the information without acting on it. I had been meaning to update my own will and trust documents since my appointment. I had not done it yet, the way you don't do the thing that requires you to imagine your own absence. December arrived. The department Christmas party was held in the 6th-floor conference room on the 14th. Dr. Tambali Reeves arrived with a bottle of wine and the particular kind of energy she brought to celebrations, which was slightly too much and entirely genuine. We stood by the window together at one point, and she asked me if I was going to Columbus for the holidays. "Christmas," I said. "My mother wants the whole family." "And your father?" I watched a taxi moving through the hospital parking lot below us, its headlights sweeping across the wet asphalt. "He'll be there," I said. She looked at me with the expression she used when she was being careful. "Miriam, how long has it been since anyone in that family has known what you actually do?" I thought about it. Kofi knows I'm a cardiologist. Emmanuel knows I work at a hospital. My father knows I stopped. "My father knows I'm still working at the hospital." "He doesn't know your chief." "No." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know eventually it's going to come out." "I know," I said. "And when it does, I know," I said again. She nodded and didn't push. It was one of the reasons she was my closest friend. I drove to Columbus on the 24th. Christmas dinner was at Emmanuel's house, which was larger than it had been, because Emmanuel had done well in construction management and had bought a place in Westerville with a formal dining room and a finished basement where the children played. There were 11 people at the table. I sat near my mother and across from a cousin who had arrived from Toronto. My father sat at the head of the table. The gifts were exchanged in the living room afterward. There were gifts for the children, which were extensive and loud. There were gifts between the adults. I gave my mother a cashmere sweater and a gift card to the spa she liked. She cried a little. Kofi's wife, Abina, gave me a candle. Emmanuel gave me nothing because we had agreed the previous year to stop exchanging. My father did not give me anything. He did not speak to me across the table. At one point, when I was pouring myself a second glass of water in the kitchen, he walked through without acknowledging that I was standing there. I drove back to Cincinnati on the 26th. 4 days later, on the morning of December 30, Celestine sent me a message at 7:14 a.m. A referral had come in from Columbus General Hospital's emergency department. The referring physician was Dr. Priya Agarwal Singh. The patient had presented overnight with chest pain and diaphoresis. The patient had been stabilized and was being transferred for advanced cardiac evaluation. The patient's name was Kwame Osai. I read the message twice. I called Dr. Tambali Reeves. "Joe," I said, "my father is coming in." There was a pause on the line. "When?" she said. "Transfer ETA is 2 hours. Another pause. "Do you want me to take it?" I was standing in my kitchen in Cincinnati with my phone in one hand and my coffee in the other, and I looked at the window over my sink, which was dark because the sun was not yet up, and I thought about Gerald Hutchinson Park and his 2 previous specialist appointments and his medical records that nobody had read carefully enough. I thought about my father canceling the appointment in March. I thought about 8 years of board-certified practice and 11 years before that of building every piece of this. "No," I said. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. I drove with the windows down despite the cold because I needed the air to stay sharp. The hospital was 41 minutes from my apartment on the days when traffic cooperated. That morning it cooperated. I parked in my reserved space in the Hargrove Memorial Physicians lot at 8:02 a.m. and I was in the cardiac wing by 8:07. Celestine was already at her desk. Transfer ETA is now 65 minutes, she said. Columbus General called at 7:50 to confirm stable transport. He's on oxygen. Blood pressure is holding at 102/68. They administered aspirin and a heparin bolus in their ER. Who's in the cath lab this morning? Dr. Okolo is primary, Dr. Fenwick is backup. David Okolo was the best interventional cardiologist in my department after me. I had recruited him from the Cleveland Clinic 2 years prior. He was 39 years old, and he had the spatial reasoning of someone who had been doing catheterizations in a previous life. Tell Dr. Okolo I'll be attending on this case. Tell him I want a full briefing when the patient arrives. And tell him who the patient is. Celestine looked at me steadily. He'll want to know if you're primary. I'll make that decision when I see the angiogram. She nodded and picked up the phone. I went to my office, and I sat at my desk, and I looked at the wall where my board certification hung beside my department appointment letter and my photograph from the November 2018 ceremony, where Dr. Patricia Nguyen Holloway had shaken my hand and said in front of 40 people that the department was in exceptional hands. I had been 41 years old in that photograph. I was 44 now. I looked like someone who had not slept enough, which was accurate and beside the point. My father was 64 years old, and he was on a transfer vehicle with oxygen running at 4 liters per minute, and a heparin drip protecting whatever was still open in his coronary circulation, and he did not know where he was going. I thought about the Christmas dinner 4 days earlier. His back as he walked through the kitchen. The way the gifts had moved around the room without stopping at me. 22 years of that specific silence. I opened my laptop and pulled up his incoming transfer records from Columbus General. The preliminary EKG showed ST elevation in leads V1 through V4, anterior wall STEMI, the widowmaker. His troponin was 4.2 at first draw, rising. The damage was already beginning. The question was how much we could stop. I was the right person to answer that question. I had known that in some abstract way for years. Sitting there at 8:11 in the morning on December 30, 2019, it was not abstract. Dr. Tambali Reeves appeared in my doorway at 8:23. I heard, she said. Close the door. She closed it and sat in the chair across from my desk without being asked. Tell me what you need, she said. I need you to be in the room when he arrives, not as a treating physician, as my colleague. She understood what I was asking. You want a witness. I want someone who knows the whole story present when he finds out where he is. She was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do, Miriam? I'm going to treat him, I said. That's all I'm going to do. She looked at me with the expression she used when she thought I was being more complicated than I was letting on. She was not wrong, but she also was not wrong that treating him was the only thing that mattered in the next 4 hours. Okay, she said. At 9:14 a.m., the paramedics brought my father through the double doors of Hargrove Memorial's cardiac emergency wing. He was gray under the lights. I have already told you that. What I have not told you is that my brothers were with him. Kofi and Emmanuel had followed the transfer ambulance from Columbus in Emmanuel's truck, and they arrived in the waiting area approximately 8 minutes after my father was wheeled into the intake bay. They had not been told which hospital. They had followed the ambulance. I did not go to the waiting room. I stayed with my father. He recognized me, as I have told you before I spoke. He said my name. I said my title. The next 7 minutes were clinical. I introduced myself as chief of cardiology and the attending physician for his case. I asked him 3 questions. Where was the pain now on a scale of 1 to 10? Did the pain radiate to his jaw or his left arm? Had the pain changed in character since Columbus? He answered all 3 in a voice that was working hard to sound normal. Pain was a 5, down from an 8, still some jaw involvement. Character unchanged. I ordered the repeat EKG and the second troponin draw. I reviewed the Columbus General records on the monitor at the bedside. I spoke to Dr. Okolo for 90 seconds in the corridor, during which I told him I would be making the call on primary operator after I reviewed the live angiogram. When I came back to my father's bedside, his eyes had not left the door. Miriam, he said, what is this place? Hargrove Memorial Medical Center, I said. It's one of the best cardiac programs in the state. You're in good hands. You work here. I'm the chief of cardiology here, I said. Yes. He looked at the ceiling. His jaw moved. He did not speak for a moment. For how long, he said. Since November 2018. He closed his eyes. I kept my voice level. Dad, I need to focus on your heart right now. The EKG shows significant blockage in your left anterior descending artery. We need to take you into the catheterization laboratory and open that artery. The longer we wait, the more muscle we lose. Do you understand what I'm saying? He opened his eyes. You're my doctor. I'm your chief of cardiology, I said. And you need surgery. I'm going to have you sign the surgical consent form now and then we're going to move quickly. He stared at me for a long time. Then he said, in a voice I had not heard from him before, smaller and without its usual architecture of certainty, okay. I handed him the consent form on the clipboard. He signed it without reading it, which was not ideal but was understandable given the circumstance. I co-signed as the attending physician of record. I gave the clipboard to the nurse on my left, then I walked into the cath lab, I approved the surgery, and I was primary operator. The procedure took 53 minutes. I will not describe it in terms designed to be dramatic because it was not dramatic in the way people imagine. It was precise. It was technical. It required, at one point, a decision about stent diameter that I made in approximately 4 seconds based on vessel morphology and lesion length, and 12 years of interventional cardiology practice. Dr. Okolo stood at my left and said, twice, nice, which from David Okolo was the equivalent of a standing ovation. We opened the left anterior descending artery. We deployed a drug-eluting stent. We restored flow. On the fluoroscopy monitor, the contrast dye moved through the coronary tree in the pattern that means the heart muscle is receiving blood again. The pattern I had first seen on a screen at the Caldwell program in Cleveland in 2004, and had spent the next 15 years learning to create deliberately. My father's heart was beating. The muscle that had begun to die was, in the sectors where we had acted in time, going to live. I stepped back from the table when it was done, and I pulled off my lead apron, and I stood for a moment in the cath lab with the particular silence that follows a successful procedure, which is a different kind of silence from the silence that follows an unsuccessful one in ways that are impossible to describe to someone who has not inhabited both. David said, hell of a case to be primary on. He's my father, I said. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know. I changed out of my scrubs and went to speak to my brothers. They were in the cardiac surgery waiting room on the 3rd floor, which is a room I had furnished indirectly. I had approved the renovation budget 2 years prior, the chairs, the small table with the tissue box, the framed landscape print on the wall that nobody had specifically chosen and nobody would specifically remember. Kofi was standing. Emmanuel was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped. They looked up when I walked in. Emmanuel stood. Miriam, is he? He's stable, I said. The procedure was successful. We opened the blocked artery and placed a stent. He's in recovery. You'll be able to see him in approximately 40 minutes. Kofi said, you did the surgery. I was the primary interventional cardiologist, yes. He stared at me. Emmanuel was doing the same calculation. I could see it moving across his face, the way you can see someone doing arithmetic when the numbers don't add up to what they expected. You're the chief here, Kofi said. Chief of cardiology, yes. Since when? Since November 2018. The silence in that room was a specific kind of silence. I have sat in enough waiting rooms to know the difference between the silence of grief and the silence of a worldview reorganizing itself. This was the latter. Emmanuel sat back down. He put his face in his hands, not because he was crying, but because he needed somewhere to put it. Kofi said, why didn't you tell us? I looked at him. I thought about the $14,000 and the truck and the apartment deposit and the Christmas dinner and the coat pocket and the folded piece of notebook paper that was currently in my glove compartment in the physician's parking lot. You didn't ask, I said. That was true. It was also incomplete. But it was all I had for them in that moment, and it was enough. I told them their father would need 4 to 6 weeks of cardiac rehabilitation, that his medical team would coordinate his ongoing care with Dr. Levin Chow in Columbus, that his health insurance coverage through his current policy would handle the procedure costs subject to his deductible, and that I would personally review his medical records before discharge to ensure continuity. I said all of this in the same voice I use with every patient's family. Because that is what they were, in that room the family of my patient, and I had an obligation to them in that capacity that was entirely separate from every other obligation and its absence between us. Kofi said when I had finished, thank you. I nodded. I said I would send a nurse to update them when my father was moved to recovery. And then I left the room because I was not finished working and I had 3 other patients whose cases needed my attention before noon. What I have not told you yet, what forms the second half of this story, is that my father's chest pain had been the visible crisis. There had been another one building for 3 years that had nothing to do with his coronary arteries. I need to go back to 2017. My paternal grandmother, my father's mother, Nana Adwoa, who had never left Ghana, died in February of 2017 at the age of 88. She had been, in her time, a market trader of considerable success. She had owned 3 properties in Kumasi. She had accumulated, over a lifetime of early mornings and careful mathematics, an estate valued at approximately $340,000 at the time of her death, denominated partly in property and partly in savings held in 2 Ghanaian bank accounts. She had written a will. I knew about the will because Nana Adwoa had written to me personally in 2014, a letter in her handwriting that arrived in Cincinnati and that I have kept. She wrote that she was proud of me. She wrote that she had heard from my mother's sister, Auntie Adwoa, that I had become a doctor in America. She wrote that she wanted me to have one of the Kumasi properties, the smaller one, on the Northern Road, which she described with the kind of precision that told me she had thought about it. She wrote that she had instructed her attorney in Kumasi to include this in her formal documents. My father had contested the will. I learned this not from him, but from Auntie Adwoa, who called me in March of 2017, a month after the funeral, and told me in a careful voice that Quame had hired an attorney in Accra who was arguing that the property distribution was invalid because the will had been drafted without proper family consultation. Auntie Adwoa said the attorney's name. She said the attorney's argument was that as the eldest surviving child, my father had precedential claim to the Northern Road property regardless of the written document. I was standing in my kitchen in Cincinnati when she told me this. It was a Sunday morning. I had my coffee. I said, "Auntie, is the will properly witnessed and filed?" "Yes," she said. "Nana Adwoa's attorney is a careful man. Everything is in order." "Then my father's attorney is spending his client's money on an argument he will not win." "Miriam," she said, "your father told the attorney that you have no significant assets. He said you are a low-level hospital employee. He is arguing that your inheritance would be wasted. That you would sell the property out of financial desperation." I set my coffee cup down on the counter. I called Sandra Corhunenbell at Drysdale, Mock and Associates the following Monday morning. I had her card from the credentialing matter. I explained the situation. I told her I needed to understand my options with regard to an international estate dispute, and I told her what my father had said to the opposing attorney about my financial standing. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "Dr. Osaibansu, do you have documentation of your current position, your salary, and your professional standing at Hargrove Memorial?" "I have all of that." "Good," she said. "I want you to gather your last 3 years of tax returns, your current employment contract, your board certification documents, your appointment letter from November 2018, and any professional recognition or publication records you have. I want financial disclosure documentation, assets, no liabilities you haven't disclosed, the full picture." "What are we doing with it?" "We're building a file," she said. "That makes your father's attorney's argument not just wrong but embarrassing." I signed the retainer agreement with Drysdale, Mock and Associates on a Thursday afternoon in January 2019. Sandra notarized the financial disclosure documentation herself. We submitted the counterfiling to the estate attorney in Kumasi in February. The counterfiling included my employment contract, my board certification, my appointment letter, 3 years of tax returns showing income above $350,000 annually, and a letter from Dr. Patricia Nguyen Holloway, chair of the Hargrove Memorial Search Committee, confirming my standing as chief of cardiology. I called Dr. Tambali Reeves that evening after I sent the final documents. I told her what I had done. "Your father's attorney argued you were a low-level hospital employee," she said, "a low-level hospital employee who would waste an inheritance out of financial desperation." There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "Miriam, that document package is going to end this argument." "That's the intention," I said. She was right, but it took longer than either of us expected. The opposing attorney in Accra filed 2 additional motions over the following 8 months, both of which Sandra addressed in filings that I reviewed before submission. The second filing included a copy of a peer-reviewed paper I had published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, which Sandra included not as a legal argument, but as a demonstration of professional standing. She told me it was unusually satisfying to include. In October 2019, my grandmother's estate attorney in Kumasi, informed Sandra that the contest had been formally withdrawn. The Northern Road property had been transferred to my name. Its current assessed value was $112,000. I had not told my father that I was engaged in this process. I had not told him that Sandra Korhonen-Bell existed or that Drysdale, Mock and Associates had filed documents in Ghana on my behalf. I had not told him that I had financial disclosure records in a sealed file that described my professional standing in terms that made his attorney's argument not just wrong, but, as Sandra had predicted, embarrassing. He did not know any of it on the morning he arrived in my emergency wing with his left anterior descending artery blocked. He did not know any of it when he signed the surgical consent form. He did not know any of it when I was standing over him in the catheterization laboratory, restoring flow to his heart muscle. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. 3 days after the procedure, on January 2, 2020, my father was moved out of the cardiac intensive care unit and into a step-down room on the 4th floor of Hargrove Memorial. He was walking short distances. His troponin had peaked and was trending down. His ejection fraction, measured by echocardiogram on day 2, was 48%, lower than normal, which was expected given the extent of the infarct, but within a range that cardiac rehabilitation could meaningfully improve. I went to see him on the afternoon of January 2. I was not his treating physician in the step-down unit. I had handed direct management to Dr. Okolo and the inpatient cardiology team, as was appropriate, because a physician should not be the primary treating doctor for a close family member if it can be avoided. But I was his chief of cardiology, which meant I reviewed every note in his chart, every order, every result. He was sitting up in the bed when I arrived. He looked better, which is to say he looked like himself rather than like something that had already begun to leave. My mother was in the chair beside him. She had arrived the previous afternoon, driven up from Columbus by Auntie Adwoa. When I walked in, she stood and put her arms around me and held on for a long moment, and she smelled like the groundnut soup she always made when she was worried about something, because she had apparently made a pot the previous night in Emmanuel's kitchen and brought it in a container for my father, which the nursing staff had gently declined to let him eat yet due to dietary restrictions. "My daughter," she said. "My daughter." I held her back. I am not going to pretend that was simple. My father looked at me over my mother's shoulder. His face was doing something complicated. When my mother sat back down, I pulled the visitor's chair to the other side of the bed and I sat in it and I looked at my father. "Your ejection fraction is 48%, I said. "The anterior wall took damage. Rehabilitation is going to be important. We'll arrange outpatient cardiac rehab in Columbus, 3 sessions per week for 12 weeks. Your insurance policy covers this fully under your current plan. I've already spoken to Dr. Levenchow's office to coordinate." He nodded. He was looking at his hands. "I also want you to see a dietitian before discharge," I said. "Your LDL was elevated in the Columbus labs. Diet modification combined with the statin we've started will make a significant difference." He nodded again. Then he said, without looking up, "The Kumasi property." I waited. "Auntie Adwoa told me," he said. "About the attorney, about what I did." "When, last night, she told your mother and your mother told me." He was quiet. "I told that attorney you were nobody. I told him you had nothing." He stopped. "I was wrong." I looked at him. He was 64 years old and he had just survived a widowmaker myocardial infarction, and his hands were folded in his lap the way I had never seen his hands before. Uncertain. Older than the hands I had grown up watching point at me across a dinner table. "You were wrong," I said. "Not cruelly, just accurately," he nodded. "The property has been transferred to my name," I said. "The contest was withdrawn in October. Sandra Korhonen-Bell at Drysdale Mock handled it. It's done." He closed his eyes. "Dad," I said, "I need you to do your rehabilitation. I need you to take the medications. I need you to see Dr. Levenchow every 3 months. That's what I need from you right now. The rest of it," I paused. "The rest of it can be whatever it becomes. But right now I need you to be a patient who takes care of himself." He opened his eyes. They were wet. I had not seen that before either. "Okay," he said, for the second time in 4 days in a voice I did not recognize. "Okay, Miriam." My mother was very quiet in her chair. She reached over and put her hand on top of my father's. I sat with them for 20 minutes. We talked about small things. The cardiac rehabilitation schedule, the dietary restrictions, the follow-up appointments, the specific dates he needed to have his stent checked. I wrote some of this on a notepad from my coat pocket and gave it to my mother because she was going to be the one who remembered. When I stood to leave, my father said my name. Not Dr. Osaibansu, Miriam. Thank you, he said, for what you did. In there, I looked at him. I'm a cardiologist, I said. It's what I do. That was true. It was also the most complete thing I have ever said to him. Emmanuel came to see me in my office on the morning of January 3. He knocked on the door frame and stood there for a moment, uncertain in a way that Emmanuel had never been uncertain in my presence. He was in his work clothes. He had driven back to Columbus for 2 days to manage a job site and come back. Can I sit? He said. Close the door, I said. Sit. He sat. He looked around my office, at the certifications, at the department appointment letter, at the view of the east courtyard through the window. How long have you known, he said, that you were going to do this? Since I was 16, I said. He absorbed that, and you never told us. I tried, I said. At Christmas in 2003, the acceptance letter. He looked at the window. I said, get the administration certificate. You did. He was quiet for a long time. I'm sorry, he said. For that, for not, he stopped. For not asking, over the years, for not asking. I looked at my brother. Emmanuel was 52 years old. He had worked in construction since he was 26, and he had done well, and he had built a life with Priscilla and 3 children and a house in Westerville, and he had never in all of those years thought to ask me what I was building. I know, I said. The will contest, he said. Did you know it was happening? I learned about it from Auntie Adwoa. Dad was wrong to do that. He said it simply, without equivocation. He was wrong. Yes, I said. Is there anything? He stopped. Is there anything that needs to be made right? From us, I looked at my brother carefully. He meant it. That was not a small thing. I have what was given to me, I said. The property is mine, the work is mine, the position is mine. I don't need anything from the family to make those things real. They already are. He nodded. He ran a hand over his face. You became the best cardiologist in this hospital and none of us knew. Chief of Cardiology, I said gently. The best interventional cardiologist in the department is David Okolo. I'm working on catching back up. Emmanuel looked at me, and for the first time in my memory, he laughed. It was a surprised sound, short and genuine. He laughed and then he shook his head and said, Miriam, just my name. But in a register I had not heard from him before. Go see your father, I said. He needs his family more than his coronary arteries need monitoring right now. He stood. He looked like he wanted to say something else and didn't have the words. He nodded once, and he went. Dr. Tambali Reeves found me in the hallway near the cath lab at the end of my shift on January 3. She had a coffee in each hand, and she gave me one without asking. How are you doing? She said. I operated on my father, fought a Ghanaian estate contest through an international attorney filing, and told Emmanuel that David Okolo is a better interventional cardiologist than I am, I said. So varying, she laughed. Is that the first time you've said that out loud? In an office, yes. We walked down the corridor together toward the elevators and she said, What happens now with your father? He does his rehabilitation. He manages his medications. He comes back in 3 months for a stress test and a repeat echocardiogram. I pressed the elevator button. We see what the ejection fraction does. I mean with you and your father. The elevator arrived. We stepped in. I don't know, I said. I don't think it becomes simple. I don't think 22 years of what it was becomes something else because of a 3-day hospital stay and a successful stent placement. But I paused. I think it becomes different. That's enough for now. She nodded. She sipped her coffee. The elevator descended. You know what I keep thinking about, she said. Tell me. That Christmas dinner. 2003. He told you that you were nobody. And 4 days ago you stood in the catheterization laboratory and held his heart in your hands. I thought about that, the fluoroscopy screen, the contrast dye opening through the coronary tree like a dark flower, my father's hands curled at his sides on the gurney. I wasn't holding his heart, I said. I was doing my job. Miriam. I know, I said. I know what you mean. The elevator opened on the ground floor and we walked out into the lobby, and the cold morning light came through the glass doors, and the hospital moved around us the way hospitals always move, purposeful and unpausing, and indifferent to the personal weight of any single moment inside it. I had been the chief of cardiology at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center for 14 months. I had published 9 peer-reviewed papers. I had a property in Kumasi, Ghana that had been my grandmother's, which I intended to visit in the spring. I had a financial advisor named Robert Pierre, whom I had engaged the previous year to manage the retirement savings I had spent a decade building from my attending salary. because at 44 years old, I was finally in a position to think seriously about a future that was mine to construct however I chose. I had a best friend who brought me coffee at the end of difficult shifts. That was my life. It was a good life. It was the life I had built in the silence that my family had given me by not asking. I want to be honest about something before I finish. My father said I was nobody. He said I would never be a doctor. He spent money on my brothers that he refused to spend on me, and he contested a will that his own mother had written specifically because he did not believe I deserved what she had given me. Those are facts. They are not things I have smoothed over or revised into something more forgivable, because honesty requires me to say them clearly. And I also want to say this. He is 64 years old, and he has 48% ejection fraction and scar tissue in his anterior wall where cardiomyocytes died before we could reach them. He is doing his rehabilitation. He calls Dr. Levin Chow's office without being reminded. My mother sends me voice messages on Sunday evenings that are warm and a little long. Kofi's daughter, who is 7, sent me a drawing in February of a woman in a white coat with a stethoscope that she labeled, in her careful printing, Aunt Miriam the Heart Doctor. I have it on my office wall. To the left of my board certification. I am not a person who has resolved everything. I am a person who built something real while the people who doubted me were busy with other concerns. I have complicated feelings about my father that I am not going to pretend are simple. I have love for him that exists alongside everything else, and that is not a contradiction. It is just the truth of what families sometimes are. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. The work you do in silence, without applause and without permission, is the only work that belongs entirely to you, and it is always the work that lasts longest. 2. Documentation is not revenge and it is not paranoia. It is the language that institutions speak, and if you learn to speak it fluently, no one's opinion of you can override what the record shows. 3. You are not required to become smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of who you are allowed to be, and the most complete answer to that idea is simply the life you build while they are still forming the sentence. Was I wrong to save my father's life without ever telling him who I had become, to let him arrive at my hospital, sign my consent form, and lie on my operating table without a word of warning? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.